By now, you all should have seen the first series of Marcus Alpha Katana, or the first episodes, to say the least. So you should have seen Entry 0, the prelude, where we talk about the birth of Marcus Alpha Katana. So clearly, the birth is extremely important to Marcus Alpha Katana in the character development. So when he was journaling, he talked about his birth, which was highly important to him. And then you notice in entry one we're going to review very quickly, the one verse that he talked about the most from his mom was, learn to tie your shoes. He remembered this one thing. That was a traumatizing entry. That was a point that was terribly tumultuous, turbulent, and traumatizing to Marcus Alva Katana. So here's what I want you to think about when you think about the learning to tie your shoes part on entry one. Imagine you have something important that you're waiting for, an important decision. Okay? And you're just sitting there waiting. And you're waiting and you're anticipating. Now imagine that feeling. Now, take that feeling and run it back. Imagine something else. Imagine somebody special to you just got hurt and they're in the hospital. Now, let's think about something different. Imagine, how many of you have grandmothers? Raise your hand, maybe. Think about that. Now, while you have your grandmother and she's in the hospital, or your mom, how many of you have lost your mom or your dad? How many have lost somebody special, a close friend, had a terrible accident that has happened? I know in some parts of the United States there's been drug addiction accidents. Other places people have had terrible accidents. Some people have just lost their parents because their parents have abandoned them, or their parents are in jail or something like that. Just imagine not having your parent there. Okay, imagine how that feels. Now imagine you're a child, and as you're this child, you're having this wonderful day at the park. It's just a normal, mundane, ordinary day. He said that. He specifically uses the words, this was a mundane day. It was a little scary to him because he's a child, and he sees all these things, and then all of a sudden, his mom is whisked away from him, out of nowhere. First, the car barely hits his mom, doesn't do anything, and it's like, his heart stops, but it's like, oh, my mom's alright. But then it's like, oh, she still slipped on the ice, and the back of her head hit the fire hydrant, and then he's like, oh my gosh, what just happened? The car didn't hit her, but somehow she still had a freak accident, slipped on the ice, and her head is bleeding out on his ice. It's so traumatizing, he can't even describe it in words. He can't even say what happened. He can't even say that her head is bleeding on the ice. He has to sit there and say that a red faucet is pouring blood. So he can't even say in words or put in words what happened. He had to write it in poetry because it hurts him so much to put it in words. Okay. And now, at the end of this chapter, in entry one, he goes back to learn to tie your shoes, because he's thinking about the last lesson that his mom taught him. The last thing his mom taught him while he was on earth. So that brings us to entry 2, another dark night. His mom wasn't the only one that taught him lessons, but his mom left some gems for him. His mom said, his mom used to sit there and say, all the time, be a good boy. What goes around comes around to bite you squarely on your pride. Boy, you must understand. Okay? This one thing, the important thing about life is that you remember God while you're young. You reap what you sow. Okay? So the one thing that she says, the important thing about life is that you remember God while you are young and seek to live right You reap what you sow. Therefore, you should sow love, goodness, and truth. Another thing that she ends up saying is everything else, okay, she says everything else is a meaningless chasing of the wind. She says everything else is a meaningless chasing of the wind. Seeing my mother's corpse reminds me of my father's death. I pondered about my mom's quick death. Which reminds me of what she said when I sought to do wrong. The interesting thing about this is his mom's death, it encapsulated every single lesson that she taught him. And it locked it in. And that trauma left everything good that she taught to him. So everything good that she taught to him, all those good memories, all those good lessons, they stuck with Marcus Alpha Katana for the rest of his life. Because in the prelude, he said dark choices and right choices. So he had the opportunity to make bad choices. But in his head, he made it up that I've got to make these right choices because in entry 2, some things are happening here. Okay? So in entry 2, Another Dark Night, Marcus, he deals with his mother's funeral. Okay? So we talk about Marcus's mother's funeral. So that funeral is really big because, I mean, he's looking at this bed and he's like, oh my gosh, this is an expensive bed. He comments, he's like, this bed is more expensive and more comfortable than any bed I've ever slept in. He's kind of like, man, I wish, why is she in this comfortable bed? She's not around anymore. So he's smart enough to comprehend that this casket is a forever bed. That's probably what he's thinking. Okay, I'm the author, so you have a little bit of insight here. But that's what he's sitting there saying. He's saying, my mom's in a forever bed because they spent a lot of money on this bed. Then he sits there and Marcus's father meets a homeless man later on. So what's happening is, later on in entry 2, as he's thinking about his mom at the funeral, his mind is flashing back to the horrible things that happened with his father. Because his father, right here, says Marcus's father was shot and killed. Okay? So, with that, Marcus's father was shot and killed. With that being said, Marcus's father being shot and killed in this story is important. Why was Marcus's father shot and killed? The story doesn't really say. If you look at it, you can infer something from it. But what do you infer? I'm not going to answer what you can infer from that. But the Reaper said it when he shot him and killed him. And the short version is, the Reaper said, if you don't pay the bills, then the Reaper will come to get you. Why did Marcus's father owe the Reaper, a prominent drug dealer, a bill when he's being a missionary for a church? That's an interesting question to ask. But another thing to point out is the character development of this. Marcus points out that he learned a lot from his mother, and he followed his mom's way and not his father's way. But he did learn some lessons from his father. He didn't discount those. But I wanted to go back to that last quote before to wrap this up. The one lesson that he learned from his mom that he pointed out about this chapter was, be a good boy. What goes around comes around to bite you squarely on your pride. But you must understand this one thing. The important thing about life is that you remember God while you're young. You reap what you sow, therefore you should love goodness and truth. Everything else is a meaningless chasing of the wind. Seeing my mother's corpse reminded me of my father's death. I pondered about my mom's quick death, which reminded me of what she said when I sought to do wrong. So, every time he thinks about doing wrong, the two things he remembers is his mom's death and his father's death. His father died because he was shot by a drug dealer who owed a debt to a prominent drug dealer. So his father died because he was shot by a drug dealer and owed a debt. His mom died by a freak accident. But while he lived with his mom, his life was okay, and there was a lot of good things. I want you to think about that. What impact did this have on Marcus Alpha Katana, and how do you think this carried on into entry 3? So we're not going to go on much further. I just want you to think about the impacts that this had on Marcus's character development as we continue the story.